Hey everybody, we are going to start our grant writing overview. So some people might be wondering, why are we starting this kind of material this early in the semester? And the reason is because grant writing is very complex. It has a lot going for it, and it will take more time to go through than I've allotted. So I'm trying to spread out the material to make the workload doable and give you time to digest everything. So I felt like it was important to get going on this material a little bit earlier than I had planned. But again, that is hopefully to your benefit and will get you more preparation in advance. So yeah, we'll start with grant writing. I have successfully written $3.78 million in grants. And I've also been a grant reviewer and I've been a grant evaluator. So I've been on all sides of the table. I've written grants for federal government, state government, local foundations, and everything in between. Largest single grant I received was a $3 million grant, and then I've received other grants that are, a couple $100,000 and some as small as $3,000. So I've done all levels for all different kinds of organizations. I've learned quite a few things, and I've been writing grants for the past 10 years. So have some experience and some knowledge that would be useful, and I just feel like this is the biggest skill coming out of this class that you can hopefully have some experience with and eventually add to your resume as something you can contribute for your future employer. But let's start with what a definition of a grant is. A gift of money from an organization, foundation, or government entity, not an individual donor, that does not have to be repaid. So it's free money, but don't treat it like free money. There's a lot that goes with it. Grants are given to various organizations for such costs as administrative, labor, programs, capital purchases, equipment, buildings and real estate, enhancing capacity and training, rehabilitation, product development, and research. You can use them for all kinds of things. And you'll see some examples in the book that is assigned with this module by Ellen Karsh and Arlen Sue Fox, called The Only Grant Writing Book You'll Ever Need. And they have incredible roundtables and best practices in there. It was published in 2019, which I appreciate because it's after the financial crisis of 2008, 2010, and kind of gives some insight as to how the funding environment has changed in that scenario, especially when funding and budgets get tight after major financial crises. You'll appreciate that advice too, and that will set more realistic expectations. So make sure you've already taken a dive into that book. It's invaluable advice, and as a grant writer, I can support it fully. I've seen these kinds of things they're talking about in my own work. Let's go on the other side of the table. What is a funder? A funder is a person or organization that provides money or financial support for a particular purpose. Many funders examine what the organization or program intends to achieve and whether or not the org has a track record of doing so. The data and factors contributing to the results are analyzed, and new changes and efforts for sustainability are considered. So I've actually done grants like this before that are multi-year grants. And at the end of 1 year, you want to continue your program or project into a second year, year 2, year 3, year 4. And you have to do a lot of reporting to show you're worthy of the investment. And you should continue the project. So sometimes you get a grant that's actually spread out over multiple years because it takes time to get to certain outcomes or goals or results that you're after. Sometimes you have to do the setup, then you have to run the program, then you have to kind of retrain, regroup, maybe even get it going on its own, so it can kind of break away from the supports and kind of be a fully fledged, standing entity. And that can take several years to happen, especially when you look at things like hiring and funding and getting assets, getting buildings. It can take a lot of work. So yeah, multi-year grants are part of my expertise as well. What funders are looking for? A bottom line. That's pretty easy. Think about it this way. Funders are social investors for the common good. Is your organization capable of doing what you say or promise to accomplish? There has to be a match there. They have to have good results. Will you handle their money responsibly? Will you have a social return on investment or benefit society somehow? So they want to know if they're going to get an outcome that works with what their organization is about. So it's really about finding a match between the two of you. They want to see a sound project that incorporates measurable outcomes. And we're going to have a whole assignment that goes into this called building logic models. I know you're going, what is a logic model? It's essentially a map. It's a graphic that shows what your goals are, what your investments or your inputs are, what you're coming to the table with, what you're hoping to achieve, what the major activities of the grant are, and how you know if you're successful, both in the short term and the long term. That's a logic model. We're going to be making those in class, so that'll be a really fun project to do. And you can basically map out your entire project on that model. And I'll even show you some examples later on in this presentation. I've had to build many a logic model for grants in my day. They can be a little cumbersome to do at first, but once you get the hang of it, they're actually really handy documents. They also want to have a project with best practices. So don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's tons of research out there that can get you going on the best way to approach, using strategies from the industry you represent and approaches. So make sure you follow best practices. Don't just try to do kind of stuff that sounds like a good plan or you think is going to work. That's just not going to be persuasive for a funder. You want to see a good use of resources, using existing funds your organization has, gifts in kind, volunteers, collaboration with strategic partners. You'll see this in the form of what we call MOUs. Those are also known as memorandums of understanding, or some letter of support that says, I'm going to partner with this group and also provide services or programs or training or assets alongside their project, so you don't have to shoulder all of the cost or all of the investment, funder. That's a really, really good thing to have. It shows a diversity of funding, so you don't put all your eggs in one basket. We'll talk about things like gifts in kind and what that actually means in an upcoming slide, because there's a lot of jargon when it comes to grants. They also want to see qualified staff. They want to make sure that you have the right personnel in place to successfully run your project. And just going back up one bullet with volunteers, if you are going to be using a lot of volunteers, you really need to think about writing into your grant a staff position that's going to manage your volunteers so that you don't have turnover and your grant activities come to a complete and total halt. So that's something you have to think about, is how you're going to run the grant, what existing employees are going to be used, or what volunteers are going to do, and how you're going to manage that work group. You also want to have success rates, a track record, and stories documenting the benefits. That can be really hard to do if you're the new kid on the block and you haven't really gotten a grant before, and you're a new organization, because you don't really have much of a track record yet. So it's kind of hard to do, but you can show clients and constituents that you serve that show how your group is making an impact, and that can be the beginning of your track record and showing potential success. So that's what you kind of have to do if you don't really have the track record yet. But chances are, if you're partnering with an organization, they will have successfully won some grants and been able to document that success that you can kind of write about to say, this is our evidence that we're doing things right and that we've been successful. The funder also wants to see strong evaluation and follow-up. This is where grantees or grant awardees, the seekers, really mess up, okay? They get so excited about getting the money and running the project, they forget to do the evaluation. And I have never seen funding yanked out from underneath somebody so fast as when they didn't do the evaluation, or the evaluation wasn't strong. Suddenly, you're standing on shaky ground. The funder is not convinced that you're doing what you say you're doing, and feels like their outcomes are not being met, and that you might be a risky investment. So all of a sudden, they can terminate your project. You're done, game over. So make sure you have someone that's working really hard on the evaluation piece, whether they know how to do program evaluation, follow-up. And this comes from classes like you've had in the major on research methods. We talk about things like case studies and focus groups and surveys and program evaluation, participant observation, where you can document the kinds of behaviors, activities, outcomes, results, attitudes, experiences that are happening because of your project, program, or innovation. So you need someone that can actually do that documentation and reporting and provide that information to funders in a way that underscores your success. They also need to be a good communicator. You don't want to leave funders kind of in the dark wondering, what's going on. And then finally, an innovative piece. Now, I know we said earlier you should be following best practices, which is true, but sometimes a grant will say, I want to see a new approach, strategy, or product that goes after this target area or this issue or problem, because what we've been seeing done is not quite hitting the mark, and we want to see maybe something new. So that doesn't mean you have to kind of come up with something all on your own. It might be that you go to the research and you find some things that have promise, but they've never been tested. They've never been put into practice. And that is a great place to go. So all these skills from your degree in sociology or criminology, they're coming together. You've been able to identify research. You've been able to find policy recommendations or implications of research that says there are relationships between these things, or these things are worth investing in, or these things are risk factors. These things provide a strong advantage or keep people out of this issue or provide benefits to this group. But many times as researchers in criminology and sociology, we don't get a chance to do the application. So again, if you're interested in going for grants, you want to really get well acquainted with the industry research. Look at the academic journals. What has been suggested as something promising, but maybe never has been applied or tested to a group or a project or program? That would be a great way to find some innovation, to say, hey, this is backed in the research. We have strong evidence to support these ideas, but they just haven't had an opportunity to provide the test. And this grant or this project provides that opportunity. So that would be a really exciting thing to get to do. Let's go into some grant funding, definitions, I should say. So we kind of are throwing some jargon around. What are in-kind and matching funds? So an in-kind contribution is something we call a non-cash contribution of a good or a service that can be given a value and is used in achieving your program objectives. So it might be, giving someone a truck or a building space or servers to handle some of the activities that you're working on. It might be giving someone some free airtime, to advertise for your program. It might be, donations from some business, right? So it's an in-kind contribution. It's not cash, but it's something you need to actually run your project. So in-kind services are valued at their fair market value. So it doesn't mean what it's actually worth. In other words, they're not valued at what you would pay for them if they're not donated. It's fair market value is always what they're valued at. So keep that in mind. I do ask a quiz question about that. Some programs have a matching requirement where a certain percentage of the total cost of a program must come from other non-grant sources. So let's talk about matching funds. So matching funds have to do with what is your own contribution. So I actually had a grant I wrote for the federal government asking for funding for a program to support foster and adoptive children in the child welfare system. So we were asking for several $100,000, and in return, the state of Oklahoma was also pledging a few $100,000 of its own in the form of matching funds, saying, hey, you give a little, I'll give a little. And so that way we're kind of eliminating the funding burden on the federal government, and we're showing that we are serious and we're putting our money where our mouth is. So it's a nice way to say, hey, this is something that's going to be a long-term project. This is not just a one and done project. This will be something that we see having permanency, and it's worth the investment. So again, for example, if a local business donates funds to your organization to help offset some costs of training volunteers, then it could be used as a matching fund for your program. If a local business donated the expertise of one of its employees to train your volunteers instead of donating funds, again, that would be an in-kind contribution that could be used as a match. So you see, okay, they're donating their time, that's in kind, and they're contributing funds that the grant funder doesn't have to give, that's a match. So this is how you can kind of start to wrap your head around some of this jargon that is unique to grants. Some more jargon: program or project costs. These are costs that are allowable, that are borne by the grantees. Those are often in the forms of payroll taxes, salary and benefits, assets, buildings, real estate. So these are things that you may have to assume or bear the cost of that don't come from the grant, okay? You can ask for reimbursement for those things, or the grant can make payments toward them, but you have to fund those costs yourself up front. And sometimes you don't get reimbursed. It's just something you have to contribute to your project. Federal share, the costs borne by federal funds. So this is the federal government's share or portion of the investment that they will actually contribute. Then we have cost sharing, or something we call a federal match. So cost sharing is costs not borne by federal funds, meaning that this is coming from some other organization. Okay, so this could also be what we call matching funds, right? But we just use a lot of different words for it: cost sharing, matching. So that means some more contributions that are coming from other organizations, but not the funder, which in this case, we're talking about federal funders. And then we have in-kind contributions, which we just discussed on the last slide. Non-cash donated goods or services, okay? And often they're called in-kind gifts as well. In fact, I've seen that at the university level, where we have a donor who has a magnificent library, all kinds of rare books, and they wanted to make that an in-kind contribution or a gift to the university library. And their library was fair market valued at about $10,000. So so we received that as an in-kind contribution for a project they wanted to expand their catalog. Finally, program income. You can receive income from your own activities. So it's not that you have to just kind of suck up the money from a grant and you can never get anything in return. But of course, you would have to make sure that you're following the guidelines of nonprofit status, 501c3, or it could be 501c4, 501c5, 6, 7. There are a bunch of different kinds of 501s. 501 refers to the IRS code that designates an organization as a not-for-profit, meaning that they are tax exempt. There are different conditions that come with other kinds of codes that organizations are identified by. And so make sure you pay attention to that, because I do ask quite a bit about that on the quiz as well. So there's a different code for churches than there are for fraternities and sororities, than there are for chambers of commerce, than there are for alumni associations, than there are for neighborhood block grant groups or HOAs. Okay, so it depends on the kind of group you're talking about. Will have a different type of nonprofit status. But yes, these can receive program income. Again, but this is regulated by the IRS as far as how that income is reported and what it's used for. Further, what funders are looking for? They're looking for a sound organization that shows an active board or directors that have active leadership that actually participates. So you don't want them to be board or directing in name only. They need to be attending meetings. You need to make sure you're showing those meeting minutes and showing that they're involved. So, or showing some of the projects or outcomes or results that they've achieved in the last few years, so that they can see that they are doing something. They're not just a name on a website. You need to show solid financials. Sometimes funders will ask for copies of year-end budgets to see where you're at. They also want to see evidence of matching funds. What's your contribution to the project? And they want to see low or no risk to their investment. They should also see a sufficient or balanced budget with limited liabilities and no outstanding debt, or limited outstanding debt. It's okay to be in debt, like maybe you're paying for a building and you're on some kind of building lease, or maybe you have leased vehicles in a fleet of vehicles. Of course, those are liabilities. Those are things you owe. Maybe you don't have the titles on these kinds of assets. That's fine, because that's reasonable. But you don't want to have, financial burdens that it looks like you're going to be, doing kind of fishy things with the grant money and maybe paying off debts, or because you can't get income in other ways because no one would touch you with a 10-foot pole because you're not a good investment, you're risky, right? So you want to make sure you show sound finance. You should also show a history of past funding, which we mentioned earlier is hard for new organizations. But sometimes you can show donations. You can show, volunteering and some of those kind of things as alternatives to showing a history of past funding if you're new to the game. You can also show a variety of funding sources. Maybe you're asking for grant money from several sources. So again, spreading out that burden of investment across more than one group. And it also shows your willingness to collaborate and to seek funding from multiple places. Administrative overhead costs versus program spending. Realize that in the grant world, administrative overhead costs can be up to 50% of the grant fund, which is, to me, extremely high. A more reasonable rate would be 25% off the top, and I've seen it as low as 10%. But essentially, these costs are what it costs for us to cover any of the office work, the copies, the payroll taxes, the salary for people that have to run the numbers, that have to facilitate disbursement of funds, the accounting parts, any of those kinds of office administrative costs to get everything going and in place is kind of a hit to the organization. So sometimes they say, hey, we need to assume some of the costs for actually running this thing. It's seen as overhead, meaning they're not really getting anything for running a grant, so we need to cover some of that burden of cost. And they're looking at that versus program spending, right? So they want to kind of see, how much are you going to take for your own pockets versus what's going into the actual program that I'm trying to fund for you. So not being too greedy with what you need. Now, it's not completely unreasonable for administrative overhead costs to also assume a little bit of income for things like raises or performance-based merit increases and things like that. That's not out of the question, but you have to be careful. And those are regulated, and you don't want to do anything illegal. That's going to set you back. And of course, excellent record keeping, lots of documentation. How to prepare your organization for winning grants. So you want a well-written proposal that is clear and succinct, follows directions exactly, and I mean exactly. You would be surprised how much fine print there is in an RFP, a request for funding proposal. Some of these can be 200 to 300 pages long, and yes, you need to read all of them. It takes a long time to read a proposal and actually get it out there. And they have very specific things they ask for. They say 12-point font, and it must be this kind of font, and you must be double spaced. If you don't follow those directions, I've actually seen people's grants thrown in the trash because they didn't follow directions. Even though the project was really sound and it looked like a really, really good proposal, it just didn't give the reviewers any assurity that if they're not going to follow directions from day one, how can we count on them to follow directions, on day 30, on day 365? I mean, it just set yourself up for success by following directions exactly. That's a really easy way for grant reviewers to get rid of poorly written applications. They find things that they didn't do, that they were asked to do, and boop, into the trash they go. Also, they should appeal to the heart and the head, making logical sense, and also, just being kind of that heart appeal, right? Making sure that you're doing something for the public good, that it brings, some kind of joy and satisfaction into people's lives. It should provide solid examples and evidence to support what it's doing. And again, that's when those letters of support or MOUs are really important. And it should demonstrate that you want to help the funder achieve their overall goals. So you have to really analyze the funding organization. What kind of projects do they tend to fund? What is their mission statement? What do they like to invest in? You should align really well with that organization. You don't have to align perfectly, but you should be on the same page somehow because you're an investment, and that's how funders see you. So a basic grant toolbox, you want to have these kinds of things in place to be competitive for a grant. You need a leadership list, positions and involvement, things like job descriptions, your board from your organization that oversees your activities. You should probably have at least 2 years of financials. Those are kind of operating costs and budget statements. You should have a 501c3 letter or a 501c4 or whatever 501 status of the IRS your organization has, something that documents that you are officially a nonprofit. Staff resumes that are going to be working on the grant. They want to see how qualified they are. Any other funding sources, you should have an organizational program or budget so they can see in an itemized way how the funding will be used. They want those past successes, those letters of support. They want to see letters of stakeholder collaborations of how you're going to kind of maximize the activity. They want to see written plans for execution. They want to see timelines. And they want to see research on your organization or population you want to serve to show the need and show how your program or project is filling that need. So these are the elements of a successful grant proposal. And we'll get into more details in this in a future lecture. But you want to state the need or problem to be addressed. And this is where you put in all that cool research. When we've taught you in research methods class how to write literature reviews, those skills come to play when you do state the need or problem to be addressed. You're identifying how maybe a population has been underserved, or how they need the innovation, or they don't have the supports they need. That is what you want to be writing about. And the research will help you document that. You also want to target a population who gets the benefit of the grant. You want to show those collaborations. You need to very thoroughly describe your program or project in a description. And you usually have word counts or page counts on that, so pay very close attention to that. Some programs, some grant funding proposals say you need to say in under 500 words what your project is. And sometimes that's harder to do, to actually boil it down to 500 words. if it's a grand project. And then certainly you need to document your organization's capabilities and history. So these are kind of the sections of an application, but we're going to go through this in more detail in a future slide, and I will see you then.